Hello, we're back again to look at our last double grouping of theological structures, Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Now, we can only really skim the surface of these two because they're pretty vast and they have a really long history. So we're just going to hit the high points and that's it. If you want to read deeper or think more fully on these, you can dive into some really good historical theologies that are out there, but we're only going to hit the high points as far as we're concerned. Again, looking at history, authority, scripture, interaction with environment, and result. A little bit of history. Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism were once one. Of course, both trace their history back to the apostles via apostolic succession. And if you may recall, apostolic succession is the idea that the apostles chose their successors, and those successors chose theirs, and so on down the line, so that every bishop today, whether Orthodox or Catholic, should be able to trace his line of succession all the way back to one of the original 12. By the first generation after the apostles, the church had begun to vest authority in apostolic teaching, both written and oral. The written apostolic teaching became the New Testament. The oral apostolic teaching became the foundation for what we call the tradition, or the hermeneutical key for interpreting the scripture. Now, let's look a little bit at why there is Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. As I said, they were once one, but I call this a tale of two cities, because that's the name of a famous book, and because I lack a lot of original creativity. But there are two worlds, the East and the West, two halves of the empire. If you know anything about the Roman Empire, you know that the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century uprooted the capital of the empire from Rome and moved it to Constantinople, which is today's Istanbul. So there are two halves of the empire, the East and the West, and two languages, Greek and Latin. The East spoke Greek, the West spoke Latin, and those drew up a barrier right there, that there's a language barrier between East and West. Not so much anymore, but in the medieval and late patristic times there certainly was. Two emphases, wisdom and war. The East is in love with philosophy. The West, the Romans, were a warrior, martial people, and they had different ideas of what was great. Two completely different approaches to God and the church. And I don't have time to get into those differences here, but just take my word for it, there were huge differences between the East and the West, and ultimately led to their split in 1054 with the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople excommunicating one another, which broke into Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism, and that division remains until this day. Probably will always remain. Authority. The authority resides in the bishop, the magisterium, the college of bishops, the college of bishops, cardinals, pope, metropolitan, archbishop. The bishop is still the source of authority in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Later, the bishop of key cities became most important. Key cities like Rome and Alexandria, Constantinople, Antioch. These cities became the most important cities. Therefore, their bishops had the most important things to say. Rome became prominent in the West after Constantine moved the empire east. So therefore, Rome and the church in Rome particularly filled that power vacuum. And so in the Latin-speaking Western Roman Catholic Church, the Pope became the number one most important bishop of all. Tradition and Scripture are largely equal in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Tradition handed down from the apostles and bishops became apostolic teaching and formed the body of tradition. The Pope's rise in the West and later the Great Schism over some items in the tradition helped force a split, but they were pulling apart anyway. You hear Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism both say the same thing about Scripture. It is the church that formulate Scripture. The church owns the Scripture because the church is the one that gave it its final stamp of authority, which is 180 degrees different from Protestants who believe Scripture came first and that constituted the church, which is something that you will see that is different between the two. But that's not to say that Scripture isn't important in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Far from it. Scripture is holy and treasured, but it can only be interpreted by the bishop. Interpretation lies with the church. It does not, and the bishops or his appointed designees within. It does not lie in the common people. It is only the work of the church as a constituted body of bishops, which is, again, does not sit well with Protestants. Protestants believe that interpretation is possible by anyone within the church, especially those Protestant traditions that uphold the idea of the priesthood of the believer, like my Baptist tradition does. But that's not so in Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, where the bishop is the interpreter of Scripture. Interaction with environment. Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy still exist in its largest numbers within the church-state and the state-church, where political and religious are intertwined, and sometimes you can't tell where one begins and the other ends. The church is infiltrated into culture in order to transform it, but at the same time, we cannot say but that the church is transformed by the culture that it has infiltrated. The result, both bodies are still going strong and will continue to do so. There's no slowing down either one of them. They still remain the biggest bodies, even though there are probably more Protestants numerically than Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Orthodox is still a much healthier body, given the fact that they have not splintered into a million different parts as the Protestants have. Well, that's it for this week. Just wanted to introduce you to those, and wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.